With just about 20 years of patches, updates and changes, every single class, new or old in World of Warcraft, has undergone so many changes that they are unrecognizable from how they were day one. Whether it's due to new abilities, talent reworks, balancing updates, PvP changes or anything in between, whatever your main is, it's had one massive journey over the years to reach where it is today. But when was your class at their best? When were they the most broken, the most overpowered? If you could pick one patch or update that Blizzard did that truly made your class into an unstoppable machine, when would that be? Well, that's what I'm going to be trying to answer today. One state of every class when they were arguably at their most powerful ever. I do have some rules here as well. I'm not going to be covering exploits as they can often be non-class specific. I'm also not going to be covering bugs as they were never intended ways to play the game. I'm looking for updates that Blizzard implemented. They checked them out on the PTR, they put them in the game, they said, yep, this looks fine, and then they either had to nerf them fast, or in some cases, they just stayed overpowered for a very long time. And these can also be PvP or PvE related. And I wanted to do honorable mentions for pretty much every class here, but as you can tell from the length of the video, there was already enough to say, and I'm just going to do my best to cover one thing per class. If anything, there'll be a lot of comments with people remembering different states of their class and the moment in time that they would have picked for when they were the best. So definitely let me know what you think, and I'm always up for doing a part 2. With all that said, this for me is the most broken and overpowered state of every class in World of Warcraft over its 20-year history. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev is a platform dedicated to teaching back-end web development from start to finish in the Python and Go programming languages. It keeps this learning journey interesting and fresh by treating it as though it's an RPG experience where you're very much in charge of the pace at which the action happens. To that end, it has achievements, leaderboards, daily goals, and much more. It builds a scenario where you can set the pace and get things done at your own speed. And above all, Boot.dev wants to get you hands-on writing and understanding your own code, as that's such an effective way to learn the content. But even, for example, if you just wanted to try Boot.dev out before committing to something more long-term, it really is a risk-free endeavor. All the content is free to read and to watch in guest mode. Also, there's a 30 days no questions asked refund policy, as well as a free demo of every course and its interactive features. Back-end development can end up being a career with high earnings and often has remote work positions too, so why not give it a try? You can click the link in the description box below and use my code WILLE to get 25% off your first order for Boot.dev. That'll be 25% your first month or year, depending which you choose. Many thanks to Boot.dev for the sponsor today. Let's get on back to WoW. We're gonna make a start with the plate wearers today and descend down the order of armor types. And we'll begin with warrior. When I think of warrior's most overpowered state, it wasn't a patch or an update where they were changed. It was an expansion. For me to choose warrior's most overpowered state ever, I have to go for Fury Warrior throughout literally the whole of vanilla. If you played much vanilla during classic, era, and so on, I'm sure more often than not, you've seen a whole lot of warrior on your DPS meters. And one of the key reasons why is how their resource, rage, scaled as they got better gear. Infamously, warriors used to start expansions incredibly weak and then by the end of them be complete beasts. And it was really all down to rage. The reason why is warrior's rage before Cataclysm was not normalized, meaning the more damage you deal with your auto attacks, the more rage you can generate. And when you get more rage, you can spend more rage, and then you upgrade your gear and you can get more rage and you have more rage to spend, and you can kind of see the loop that happens here, where the better your gear gets, the more damage you get. But just on a much more exponential level than any other class. This made warrior scale better with gear than any other class by an absolute mile. Also, there were some extra tricks here. For example, human and orc racials for weapon skills in vanilla actually ended up giving extra hit chance. I imagine when they put these flavoursome things in the game when it was first releasing, they didn't think too much of it. They just thought, orcs, they use axes, humans use swords and maces, let's put that in the game, it sounds fun. But it ended up being extremely impactful. This bonus to 5 weapon skill also affected glancing blows. So against a boss level enemy, each auto attack has a 40% chance to be a glancing blow, which deal 65% of regular damage. But if you were using a +5 skill ratio and used an appropriate weapon, of course, this penalty will be reduced to 85% regular damage. And and auto attacks made up a significant portion of your damage, so this was kind of a very big deal. Other melee could benefit from this too as well, but other melee didn't get more resources from having their auto attacks hitting harder, so this was a bigger win for the warriors. But wait, there is more. In Classic, of course, Heroic Strike was a rage spender, not an instant attack as it was in Cataclysm. So if you were spamming Heroic Strike, you couldn't generate rage from your main hand attack because it wasn't going to be an auto attack. However, if you had Heroic Strike queued to be your next main hand attack, your offhand's hit chance would be modified as if it were also a special attack, effectively lowering its hit chance penalty from 27%, which is pretty bad, down to 6%. So if you were hit capped, it was going to hit, and you were going to keep that rage bar full and be able to spam abilities. You add on top of this world buffs and a shopping list of consumables giving you tons of bonus stats, and of course loads more crits for even more rage, and you end up with a class which, even in pre-raid BIS, could absolutely dominate others in full Naxxramas gear. And if we take a look at the top 1% of passes logged here, you can really see the end result. This first one shows the last 2 weeks of Naxxramas during Vanilla Classic, where warriors were easily doing 2 times the damage of most other classes, and here's the top 1% of performers on Classic era at the moment. Again, you can see that warriors are just absolutely crushing everyone. If you're playing vanilla and you want to do damage, you have to pick warrior. It's not a debate. And that's why for me, warrior's most overpowered state ever was in vanilla. Next up is paladin. Out of every patch this class has had, the one where I think they were at their strongest has to be right at the start of Wrath of the Lich King. In expansions before that, for the longest time, Ret had either been kind of average as a DPS or a bit of a utility pick, but this was going to change in Wrath of the Lich King. After all, this was an expansion about fighting the endless armies of the Scourge. How could the Righteous Vindicator, the Retribution Paladin, not end up being great at demolishing armies of undead? In fact, Wrath of the Lich King launch Retribution was only overshadowed by one other class, which you can probably guess what that's gonna be, more on that in a moment. But Ret in Wrath Classic, when we replayed it, was very different to what we got in 2010 originally, and it was in, to be honest, a very nerfed state. In fact, throughout Wrath Classic, Blizzard even buffed Ret a few times because it was just falling so far behind what people remembered it being. What made them good early on though was pretty simple. They were extremely easy to play, and they did a lot of damage. You walked up to an enemy and you applied Crusader Strike, Judgment and Divine Storm to their face, and it would kind of just delete their health bar. And Paladins back then of course had their great toolkit of utility through blessings and various hands as well, even though your average human male Ret Pala had somewhere between a 5 to 10% chance to have actually keybound anything other than their damage abilities. And Ret did very well in PvE and PvP as well. Launch Wrath of the Lich King Ret Pallies were just in a fantastic state, and for me it has to be one of the most powerful states they've ever been in. Of course, in major patches in Wrath of the Lich King, Ret was toned down again and again till they became a bit more tame, but then they became a bit more powerful at the end of the expansion with their 2-piece tier 10, which gave Divine Storm a chance to reset off auto attacks, as well as of course getting their hands on a Shadowmourne. All in all though, for Paladin, launch Wrath of the Lich King Retribution has to be my choice. Which means next we have the Death Knight, and this is the easiest one on the list by far. I don't even think it's up for debate which the most powerful version of DK ever was, because again, much like Paladin, it was their state they were at when Wrath of the Lich King first launched, and it's just not even close. In fact, Death Knights on Wrath's launch were the most overpowered a class will ever be in this game's history. I don't think anything will top this. When Blizzard said back then they were putting a hero class in the game, oh boy, they meant it. So let me try and break down for you what made them so overpowered. Initially, Death Knights weren't designed with any spec being made for a specific role. If you wanted to DPS as Blood, yeah, you could do that. You want to tank as Unholy, no problem. Do you want to be a hybrid Frost Unholy Blood DPS tank? I mean, yeah, sure, go for it, why not? The whole toolkit was so ludicrously overtuned, you could do anything you wanted to, and it would work, and this went for both PvE and PvP as well. In Season 1 of Wrath's PvP, DKs in barely any gear could absolutely smash their way to high ratings, and in PvE PvE, any spec combo worked for doing anything. I'll tell you a few more things about DK. On launch, Chains of Ice was initially a root before being a decaying slow afterwards. Icebound Fortitude was a 50% damage reduction, which of course made you immune to stuns with a 2-minute cooldown. And you're a DK, so you can become immune to magic through Anti-Magic Shell, which was more powerful back then, and you could immune fears too through the talent Lichborn. DK's class design when it came to their self-healing was just a few expansions ahead of every other class, and a Bloodspec DK could just live endlessly whilst doing great damage. The first version of Plague Strike used to remove heal over time effects. There was a glyph of Death and Decay that gave it a 20% chance to fear you in place for 2 seconds, and it could chain proc off of itself. And when finally you got enough people together to kill a DK, they could resurrect themselves with the Shadow of Death talent and keep on fighting as a ghoul for 45 seconds. And this worked in Arena too, by the way. The entire class was just the best at everything they could do, and the legacy of Wrath of the Lich King's launch Death Knights and how powerful they were was not an exaggeration. Over time throughout Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard would have to nerf this class again and again and again, and during that process, certain specs rose to prominence for different roles. Blood became the tank, Frost was a dual-wielder DPS, and Unholy was a two-handed DPS. Death Knight still had some of that flexibility they had from launch. For example, in Wrath Classic, it turned out that Unholy actually dual-wielded the whole way through the expansion till they got Shadowmourne, I believe. But at the end of the day, they were a shadow compared to how they were when Wrath first dropped. And by Cataclysm, Blizzard ended up cementing these roles in place for the Death Knight for the future. Either way, those first few weeks of Wrath of the Lich King on the DK were completely out of hand in the most brilliant way possible, and for me the Death Knight's best state ever is easily the launch of Wrath of the Lich King. On to the Mail Wearers, so let's start with Hunter. For Hunter, I'm going to pick something which is probably a little bit unexpected. In fact, it's from a very recent version of World of Warcraft in the grand scheme of things, but it's one where Hunters have consistently been broken for about as long as this seasonal server has existed. For Hunters, I'm picking the state they were in during early phase 1 of Season of Discovery. So as we all know, Season of Discovery, it's classic WoW's second seasonal server where Blizzard have added a bunch of rune engravings onto gear which allow players to equip new abilities. Kind of like how enchants work, but you can swap them out whenever. Now the thing that was completely broken for Hunters wasn't actually the Hunter themselves, it was their pet. So typically pets in vanilla are, well, they're good until they're not. When you're leveling, they do tons of damage, they generate loads of threat, and they're a huge asset for the Hunter. But then you get to endgame, and Hunter pets don't scale with the Hunter's own stats, meaning they fall off a cliff damage-wise and survivability-wise. On top of that, they have no reduced damage from AoE effects, so when you're on a boss that does AoE stuff, they just die to absolutely anything. And it's just kind of frustrating because, to be honest, you're lucky if your healers even have their pet frames on their bars, and you have to worry about stuff like pet food, training, happiness, you know, all of that good stuff. So along comes Season of Discovery to make changes to the original vanilla format. First up, Hunter pets would now scale with improvements to the Hunter's own gear. Also, there were 2 new runes to keep in mind. The first one was called Kill Command. This gave Hunter's pets a 60% bonus damage to their next special attack, which was reduced by 20% with each special attack. Now, this gave Hunter's pets 30% more damage and health and 80% more focus regeneration. So with all these tools in hand, Hunters set out into the world once again to find out whether any Hunter pets were overpowered with these changes. As it turns out, they were. Now the first broken one was the Scorpid pet. Now this was technically a bug which I said I wasn't going to include, but it's kind of funny so I'm just going to mention it. But Scorpid's poison wasn't consuming kill commands, so you had the bonuses from pet scaling on top of straight up a 60% damage non-stop buff whilst kill command was active, which made Scorpid do absolutely outrageous amounts of damage. Blizzard did pick up on this one pretty quick though and nerfed the interaction, but Hunters weren't quite done yet. They swapped over to using a Wind Serpent. This is back when the level cap was 25 and there were only a few Wind Serpents in the world which were low enough level to be tamed over in the Southern Barrens. With the extra focus regeneration from the Beast Mastery rune, the new scaling and kill command, Wind Serpent's Lightning Breath ability was doing absolutely absolutely outrageous amounts of damage. In PvP, hunters could hide somewhere, use Eyes of the Beast, and run around people with their pets spamming lightning breath, and it could solo any other class in the game. In fact, hunters could AFK, have their pet on defensive, and there's a pretty good chance they would win a 1v1 because their pets were just so powerful. Also in BFD for a time, hunter pets were so good, they were better tanks than any actual tank because they could generate tons of threat with Growl, and they were just doing more damage than everyone else was as well. Blizzard would end up nerfing Wind Serpents by just straight up not letting Lightning Breath work with Kill Command, and Season of Discovery is an experimental server, and hunters must have been nerfed over 20 times easily by now. They're still one of the best classes in the game, by the way, but for me the start of Season of Discovery has to have been the most powerful state that hunters have ever been in. On to Shaman, and the moment in time I pick for the Shaman is the state of enhancement during Throne of Thunder and beyond in Mists of Pandaria. Despite Mists of Pandaria changing talent trees so much, they put a lot of things you'd have otherwise found on those trees straight into your spellbook when you picked a spec, and more often than not it worked out really well. Elemental was definitely in a strong spot during the same time period too, but I'm really just trying to stick to one thing here where possible. During Mists of Pandaria, enhancement had a number of great things going for them. Elemental Blast was a new talent that could be made instant via Maelstrom stacks. This would hit really hard, as well as increasing the Shaman's own secondary stats. You had Stormlash Totem that was a thing, which is a minor DPS cooldown for the Shaman. Storm Strike, Lava Lash, and even Feral Spirit just did a good amount of damage in their own right compared to other versions of WoW, and of course Shaman gained a brand new cooldown in Mists of Pandaria, Ascendance. In MoP, Ascendance would transform your character's model and would also grant auto attacks and Storm Strike a 30-yard range, and there was just something about being able to hit stuff with blasts of wind from miles away that was really satisfying and fun to use. During this time, enhancement was able to put out some serious burst and respectable overall damage in PvE and PvP as well. A lot of these features introduced in Mists of Pandaria have carried forwards into future expansions too, as they just fit the class archetype so well. So all in all, that's why enhancement during Mists of Pandaria is my choice. Next we have Evoker, World of Warcraft's fourth brand new class on the recent Dragonflight expansion. Now initially this class launched with two specializations, Devastation for DPS and Preservation for healing, but in patch 10.15 Blizzard dropped a third spec, Augmentation. This specialization would be unique in World of Warcraft as it wasn't just directly a healer or a tank or a DPS, it was a utility class which, well, augmented their allies' capabilities. Many other games and MMOs over the years have had this utility class fantasy, and usually it's a bard that does this. It's the guy who's chilling at the back of the group, dancing about playing a lute or something. He's like your hype up guy, making your allies do what they do that bit better. Well, in World of Warcraft we have some dragon looking thing that sets you on fire and throws sand at you or something. I mean, hey, if it works, right? Anyways, this brand new edition was quickly adopted into both PvE and PvP. But where it really excelled was Mythic Plus. In this smaller scale environment, augmentation felt like it was an absolute necessity, both in terms of survivability and boosting your allies' damage. And everyone wanted an Aug Invoker for their Mythic Plus group, as well. Not only were they overtuned at launch, they just made you do so much more damage. And as we all know, more damage equals more fun. Season 2 of Dragonflight would see access to a God comp for Mythic Plus of Guardian Druid, Holy Paladin, Fire Mage, Shadow Priest, and an Augmentation Invoker, which totally dominated the patch, with people timing keys in the early 30s, and if we were to check Dragonflight Season 1 as a comparison, you can see how much more class variety there was. Also, the higher your key got, the value of Augmentation's ability to just make the party live through their shields, their CC, and just giving everyone a ton more versatility got more and more noticeable. In following patches, Blizzard would aim to tone down this new spec, and really a new role to World of Warcraft, but they remain a controversial pick. When augmentation is good, they're mandatory, and when they're bad, you just take another DPS. To this day, people argue whether augmentation was an innovation and that the support role should be embraced by more classes, or whether it was a mistake and it should be reworked into a more traditional healer. Either way, when augmentation was added into the game, things changed, and we're still feeling those effects now. Next, let's move on to the leather wearers, and we'll begin with the Druid. And for Druid, I'm going to go the state that they were in, specifically in PvP during Season 1 of Shadowlands. So one of the biggest and most controversial features of Shadowlands were Covenants. These new factions would grant you abilities upon siding with one of them, which at least early on into the expansion you couldn't change in any easy way, so you better have picked the right one. Upon siding with the Night Fae Druids, amongst other things, will be granted access to a new spell, Convoke the Spirits. This ability would fire off 16 random Druid spells over a 4-second duration. That's one spell per quarter of a second on a channeled cast. These random spells would be tailored to your specialization, but could include your hardest hitting abilities, which typically had cooldowns or you needed resources to use them. So when you press this button and the game decided to use your best abilities and have them crit, you could just absolutely erase people from the face of the game. And early on in Shadowlands PvP, a druid could pop out of stealth and press Convoke and easily global people before they had the chance to do anything about it. This had to have been one of the easiest one-button one-shots we've seen in a long time in PvP, and it makes me think back to the good old days of Pom Pyro mages. But whether it was open world, arenas or battlegrounds, a druid just appearing out of stealth and doing enough damage to kill your character 2 times over in 4 seconds was an absolute terror to behold. And that's why for Druid I've got to pick Shadowlands Season 1 Convoke the Spirits. Next up I have Demon Hunter, and once again we're going to go more on the PvP side of things. And I'm going to be picking the state they were in during PvP throughout Dragonflight. What made them so good at this point in time was to get the basics down and put out a lot of damage. Demon Hunter was really simple to pilot, and at a basic level it always has been, to be fair, with most of their damage coming from abilities such as Blade Dance or I-Beam. So even if you're a bit more of a beginner to the PvP scene, you could get great results. A lot of PvP games over the years have had that one character that's really good when you're first getting into the game, but in Dragonflight Demon Hunter was that, as well as excelling at high rating as well. They had a lot of CC through both AoE stuns, single target stuns and imprison. They had good defensive options on short cooldowns. They would just heal a bunch by existing thanks to all their bonus leech. They were extremely mobile. They always have been, to be fair, but it's a nightmare trying to kite a Demon Hunter. They had reverse magic to turn CC effects back against enemies, and just so much more going for them. And Blizzard would end up leaving Demon Hunter in a state where PvPers were calling for nerfs for months, as this class could do pretty much everything. But as we know, sometimes in World of Warcraft it takes Blizzard a while to get around to changing things when they're deemed overpowered by the community. And whilst Demon Hunters have definitely had their moments in PvP as well as PvE, for me the pick here has to be their states during Dragonflight in PvP. Next up we have Rogue, and it seems for the Leatherwearers so far, PvP content is dominating here. Now rogues are a class fantasy where a key part of it is, well, to not be fair in the first place. They play dirty and they don't adhere to any honourable rules, and this is especially true for player versus player combat. My pick for Rogue is going to be their state in vanilla for PvP. This is where the Rogue's toolkit could truly shine and they were able to pull off some incredible combos. The thing is about Rogues back then is, whilst in a great player's hands they looked absolutely unbeatable, it was easy to mess them up at the same time. You didn't have Shadow Step to instantly close the gap. You couldn't just Cloak of Shadows off mistakes or being caught. Being methodical and tracking cooldowns mattered, but all the same, Rogues could just kill your character before you even got a chance to play the game. Back in vanilla, long duration CC effects were long. Things weren't limited to 10 seconds as they were in the Burning Crusade and beyond, so when a rogue sapped you, you could just be standing there not able to do anything for 20 seconds plus. There was of course the standard cheap shot into kidney shot stunlock for a further 10 seconds of CC. They could throw in a Thistle Tea to their rotation to instantly regenerate all of their energy every so often for that extra little bit of burst, and this didn't even put their potion on cooldown either. Then of course you had Gouge to follow up, and when he talented this, it was another 5.5 seconds of CC. Don't forget about Blind either. In vanilla it was a bit different though. It was a poison effect where you had to create the reagents for it from Fade Leaf, meaning it did have more counterplay from poison dispelling effects and could be immuned off by dwarves racial stone form. But on the other hand, it was an instant cast 10 seconds hard CC, and biggest of all, preparation in the subtlety tree reset the cooldowns on all rogue abilities, including blind. This changed in TBC because getting 2 blinds in one fight was very overpowered. Combine this with the fact that every other rogue you met was undead, and Vanilla Will of the Forsaken was a 2-minute cooldown racial that removed fear and charm effects, and then made you immune to them afterwards for a short time, and didn't share a cooldown with a PvP trinket, and you end up with a class which can truly do some amazing things. It was a class that had a serious skill cap, but when played right, there were very few specs in the game that could beat it. Next I have Monk. I have to be honest here, Monk is the class which I think it was the most difficult to find a properly overpowered state. Even during their release expansion in Mists of Pandaria, they tended to be pretty fair across all of their specs. But for Monk, I think one of their best spots has to have been for Brewmasters during BFA. It's a bit of a lesser remembered expansion for sure, but arguably it was when Brewmaster Monks found their best representation as a tank, at least in raiding throughout all versions of World of Warcraft that they've existed in. During Battle for Azeroth, Monk's key damage mitigation tool Stagger underwent a bit of a rework. So Stagger had been a key part of Brewmaster's kit for a long time, and would cause some of their damage to be taken instantly and some of it over time, affecting both physical and magical damage. Managing your Stagger was key to playing a Monk well, as taking too much damage and having your Stagger stack up too much would really start to stress your healers out, so you needed to manage your cooldowns, especially Purifying Brew, really well, and this brew would cancel out 40% of your active stagger, at least it was that much in BFA. The big deal in this expansion was that your stagger was changed to be based off of a percentage of your agility instead of a flat amount, so as your gear improved, your mitigation improved. At the start of BFA it was based off 140% of your agility, and then by 8.1 it had already been nerfed down to 105%, and then all the way down to 90% by patch 8.3. But Monk at the time was the premier tank, especially on progression encounters, because their damage intake was just so smooth. And when you're tanking or healing mythic raiding, you want a tank whose health bar is going to be predictable. You don't want one that's going to be going up and down all the time too much. And Brewmaster really was able to do that during BFA. So for me, that's why I'm picking Brewmaster in Battle for Azeroth. Finally, we have the cloth wearers. We'll begin with the priest, and I'm going to be picking Shadow at the start of Legion. So Legion saw huge class changes for many different classes. Demonology Warlock became all about summoning armies of demons, Survival Hunter became melee, and Shadow Priest got access to a brand new resource, Insanity. It was also in Legion when you got a certain artifact weapon as a Shadow Priest, who I hear has kind of become a big deal nowadays in the War Within. One of the new talents added in Legion was called Surrender to Madness. This has to have been one of the most equally fun, broken, and completely unbalanceable talents Blizzard ever put in the game, but for a moment it was fantastic. Usually Shadow Priest gameplay in Legion involved activating Void Form through Void Eruption and maintaining your new resource bar Insanity as long as you possibly could through your rotation, and whilst you were in this Void Form you had a damage buff and a constantly stacking haste buff, but also while you're in Void Form your Insanity is draining faster and faster, so eventually you can't keep up anymore and you drop back into your regular Shadow form before setting up your next Void Form rotation. Now what Surrender to Madness did on its first version was completely change how you play Shadow Priest. So when you press the button it would instantly activate Void Form. Your Insanity generating abilities would generate 200% the regular amount, and you could cast whilst moving. But if you ever ran out of Insanity and left a Void Form, your character would instantly die. Horribly, as the tooltip says. And during the Race to World First of the Emerald Nightmare, the shortest Race to World First ever for a mythic raid, it was cleared in 18 hours by the way, we got to see how comically broken this spec really was. Shadow Priests were finding times during fights where there was just always something to hit, so even though they had Surrender to Madness running, they weren't at risk of dropping out of Void Form and losing their Insanity ever. Where usually a 30 to 40 second Void Form could be pretty good, with Surrender to Madness they were staying in Void Form for entire minutes at a time, and the best Shadow Priests were doing double, if not triple, what other classes could do on certain bosses. Blizzard had to hotfix Surrendered to Madness 1 month after release to nerf its bonus insanity regen from 200% down to 150%, before nerfing it even harder later in the expansion to just a 100% bonus. They tried to redesign this ability in BFA before eventually just removing the talent. I think it was a bit too problematic to ever get in a balanced state. I guess we all should have known Xal'atath was going to be a pretty powerful character when her weapon was capable of doing this at the start of Legion, but for me that's got to be the pick for the Priest. Next up I have Mage, and I'm picking their state during Hellfire Citadel and Warlords of Draenor. So WoD is generally an expansion that people look down upon, but for one class and spec it delivered some truly memorable moments. A new talent Mages had in Warlords of Draenor was Prismatic Crystal. You put a crystal down and it would take 30% bonus damage over its duration, split to nearby targets. The second consideration here was a new trinket from Hellfire Citadel called Prophecy of Fear. This made direct attacks proc a burst of damage around its targets. Now most casters could land a hit every few seconds, but Arcane Mage had Arcane Missiles, which hit many times in a row, making Mage be able to benefit from this proc way more than other casters. Also in Warlords of Draenor there was a secondary stat called Multi-Strike. This stat was exclusive to this expansion and is easy to overlook and forget about, but it gave attacks a chance to hit 2 more times at 30% of their original power, leading to some pretty extreme RNG pull-to-pull during this expansion. You combine this with all your endgame gearing and other buffs and consumables and so on during Warlords of Draenor, and if there was a boss that kind of just stood there and you can hit it for the full duration of Prismatic Crystal, what Arcane was capable of doing is completely insane. Raids back then could stack Arcane Mages and take down current content mythic bosses in 20 seconds or less because of the amount of damage they were doing thanks to all these factors. If you look at the top 1% of DPSs in Hellfire Citadel Mythic, you can see how far ahead Arcane was compared to everyone else. And if we check Iron Reaver specifically, a boss that Arcane was particularly good on, well, the DPS breakdown here almost looks as balanced as vanilla. Almost. So that's why for me Arcane Mage in Hellfire Citadel has to be the pick for this class. Last but not least, we have the Warlock, and for me there's only one period in time which I can pick for the Warlock, and that is Mists of Pandaria. Oftentimes in this video it's been about a particular spec for a class that's been overpowered. For Mists of Pandaria, it was the entire class for the entire expansion. Destruction underwent changes and got access to Burning Embers, and the version of Chaos Bolt you probably remember where it always crits. Affliction later on in the expansion was an absolute beast of a spec on single target and multi-target fights because they could spread and maintain their dots so much easier. They also got access to Malefic Grasping Mop, a channel type effect which would cause your dots to do bonus damage when it ticked. But the star of the show for Warlocks in Mists of Pandaria has to have been Demonology. It was a totally unique version of this spec which had a highly involved playstyle, needed fight knowledge, and some real min-maxing to get the most out of it. Eventually Blizzard would nerf Demonology into the ground, and we had a rather famous interview and quote come out of it where Ian Hazzikostas straight up said, "We'd rather you didn't play Demonology." But what made Demo so unique in Mists of Pandaria? Well, first of all was a new resource called Demonic Fury that was gained through your standard abilities. You could then toggle Metamorphosis on as it had a really short cooldown, and your Demonic Fury would begin to drain as well as be spent on powerful abilities. This meant Warlocks could build up resources for when they needed them and then unleash tons of damage on single target or an AoE. Oh, and also during MOP you could cast your filler spells whilst moving thanks to a new talent, Killjaden's Cunning. There was also one trinket in particular which was crazy overpowered with how Demonology worked, called the Unerring Vision of Lei Shen. Any version of this trinket was better than any other trinket for a time. It would give your spells a 100% chance to crit for a few seconds, but in Mists of Pandaria you could snapshot spells. So for example, if you refresh your dots, and especially Doom during this proc, it would cause Doom to always crit during its duration, and every single time Doom crit, it spawned an imp, and those imps cast Fireball which gave you Demonic Fury. This interaction alone was super broken for Demonology. In fact, they had to nerf the trinket specifically specifically for Warlocks because of this. But wait, there's more. There wasn't just one demon form in Mists of Pandaria, there were two. Whilst Metamorphosis was more for damage, there was also a glyph called Demon Hunting, which would unlock an alternative form called Dark Apotheosis. Unlike Meta, this was a permanent transform, and in this form you would take less physical and magical damage, as well as generating a ton more threat. Now this wasn't really intended to be a full-on tank spec, despite it mysteriously having some massive threat modifier, but you could make it work on some of the easier content in the game if you just wanted to have fun and see how it played out. This spec was also experimented with during PvP for Mists of Pandaria as well, and Dark Apotheosis was just a bit of fun really from a major glyph, but it was just something else the Mists of Pandaria Warlock had access to. But all in all, Mists of Pandaria was just a great time to play Warlock. Later on, of course, as I mentioned, Demonology would be nerfed to the ground, before in Legion, Demon Hunters came along and took Metamorphosis as an ability, whilst the demo lot would transform and be more about summoning tons of demons rather than being one themselves. And I didn't even mention in Mists of Pandaria, it was when you had the quest to go and get green fire as well. So overall for Warlock, it just has to be Mists of Pandaria, but more specifically, Demonology during this expansion. And that's it, one state of each class throughout this game is a long history during which I think they were at their most powerful. Let me know if there was a point in time different to one I mentioned, and when you think your class or perhaps spec was at their peak. Looking back and researching older stuff in this game is always something I look forwards to doing, so everyone can share the memories really, and I'm definitely up for doing a part 2 of this if it makes sense. So drop anything you would have wanted to see in the comments down below. And, as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.